The next hour is for Marigo Raftopoulos.
Thank you. Okay. Now, it looks pretty dark and dismal, doesn't it? Now, I promise you that it is going to be a very sort of positive presentation, but what we'd want to do here is build on the presentation I did last year, and I got a lot of people who were very upset, and I actually like that. So this is will probably upset a few people, but that's a good thing, because all it means is that it helps us lift our game. And speaking of games, I'm going to start off with a little easy game for all of us to play. And this is just symbolic of where gamification is today. And right at the end of the session, we'll play an improved game as another symbolic thing of how we can actually improve what we're actually doing. You up to play a little game? Yeah? Okay. Stand up and get into pairs again. It could be a different pair that you used earlier. All right. So, pick a partner. Okay. Introduce yourselves. Excellent. Now we're going to play rock, paper, scissors. Okay? Rock, paper, scissors. The best of 3 wins. Okay? Rock, paper, scissors. Yeah? Ready, set, go. Hands up. Who are the winners? Who are the winners? Okay, everyone else give them a round of applause. Okay. Now, in case I forget at the end of the session, remind me about another uplift of that game that we will play. Okay. All right, so part of this presentation, it will be in 3 parts. The first part will be on some longitudinal research that I've done on how gamification is doing, and the news isn't great, but anyway, I'll get back to that later. And then I'll sort of talk about what do we do today to improve that, and then I'll end the session with new horizons that we can explore. But like with most things, you can take it or you can leave it. So particularly with the people that I upset last year, I'm sorry, you can take the blue pill and say, gamification's fine, we're doing well, let's keep going as we're doing, and that's fine. But for the rest of you who want to take the red pill, this thing runs deep, and I'll share some information with you that will only help improve your business, your skills, and how you make a change in the world. Okay, a little bit about me. I won't go into too much detail. Michael sort of described a little bit of detail there. I like to push the boundaries. I like to explore the edges. When I started, blogging in 2008, that wasn't good enough that I had information, that I had connections with people. I had to go in and do a deep dive into research. So I did all that sort of PhD research. I sort of come out, and it's almost like, well, that's not good enough. There must be more. And I've sort of found that more in terms of always not taking anything for granted, always asking the why, always asking how can we do things better. And I think this is sort of part of the conversation that Gamification Europe has been sort of pushing, that our sponsors have been sort of always working on, and this is a great call to action for all of us to create a community of just improving where we're at. So in terms of, like I mentioned earlier, I'll have some symbolism from lovely games that I like, just to sort of do the subliminal thing. This is from Journey. So today, part 1 is where we are today. And I'll go through those statistics and research findings. Second part will be tomorrow. What do we do tomorrow that when we leave sort of this session? And 3, we'll explore new horizons. Okay, so part 1 today, longitudinal research, the reasons for the decline. And so yes, gamification has become less popular amongst the early adopters and innovators, key lessons we can learn, and also there are some deeper issues and global challenges that are affecting us that are not necessarily totally our fault. Okay, a little sip. A little bit about the research. I started this as part of my PhD in 2012. In 2014, I did a big study, audited 300 different examples of gamification, and that helped create a taxonomy and a design framework and a capability framework. But we sort of went deeper into that. So of those 300 global projects, we collected 25 organisations that showed real innovation, a lot of leadership, a lot of foresight, and a lot of best practice that they were using. So in 2014, we surveyed 25. And also the combined projects of that survey in the 25 had 11.5 million affected users. So even though it was 25 organisations and projects, there was a lot of people around the world that were using their gamified applications. Now, I resurveyed those 25. I got 23 responses back, so it's a bit of a few of them dropped off. They sort of disappeared, but anyway. But it's still the same group, same organisations. So we're trying to sort of look at those early innovators and those early adopters. Where are they now? There's not a lot of big names there too. Okay, so the bad news is that amongst those early adopters and innovators, only 60% of those organisations are no longer involved in gamification. Now, I thought that was a bit disturbing. What is that? And there was 20% said they were less involved, 10% they were involved about the same, and another 10% said they were more involved. So something has happened over that time, over that sort of 4-year period, that these people, that before I spoke to them, they had already been working on their own in gamification for a couple of years. So a lot of time and effort and investment was put into those spaces. And at the time in 2004, they were very happy with gamification. So something had moved. So looking a bit deeper into that, in terms of their satisfaction levels, in 2014, nearly 30% were very satisfied. And in 2018, that dropped to about 10%. In the middle, somewhat satisfied, 31% in 2014, and that sort of rose a little bit in 2018, and as you can see, the rest. So what's happened is that they've moved from being satisfied to somewhat and nearly satisfied, and perhaps not so much. So there's been a dwindling satisfaction level with the gamification projects and with gamification generally. Net Promoter Scores. If you're familiar with Net Promoter Scores, how rating out of 10, how would you recommend to a colleague? And as you can see, there's been sort of a sizable decline in that. Whereas, say, for example, most organisations were sort of great promoters of gamification in 2014, that certainly dropped quite a bit, and we sort of got a lot more passives and a lot more detractors. So those early innovators and early adopters are no longer singing the praises of gamification as something that can really help organisations improve their performance. Digging deeper into sort of some of the comments that they made, there's been an erosion, and a lot of it revolves around gamification on its own is not a viable business tool, and that's sort of their words that they use. And other things that they said, continuous bad design was one of the reasons they lost interest. It was obvious and dull strategies that a lot of the platforms and the designs were using. They lost interest, there was no buy-in, and it was just not convincing enough for their organisation to continue. It's a fad that peaked. And the business principles behind it were lacking. So a lot of the comments were sort of surrounding sort of any one of those particular areas. So my question, I'm not sure, okay. Have we dropped the ball? Us as consultants, as designers, as platform providers, have we dropped the ball with what gamification is? What was the real hope that we had all those years ago, in 2008, 2009, 2010? There was something that was special and compelling about gamification at that time, but we've sort of perhaps lost something in translation. So I sort of looked a little bit deeper further into that. So there were sort of 3 core reasons, and the first one was a lack of leadership support. So in their own words, there was no focus and interest in the concept inside their organisation. There was now less support in the organisation, did not fully buy in the first place, which was sort of quite interesting. So it was always the internal project person who sort of really wanted to push it was obviously personality based, and they were able to sort of sell it inside. But once they lost support and interest and hope, then the whole thing had to sort of be let go. And one organisation said they were absorbed into HR as just a training tool, and obviously a lot of organisations feel like that's where a lot of things go to die. So that was sort of their attitude. So my question, not that I didn't ask them, but it's sort of something I'm asking us, is that given that these organisations feel that way, are we reaching the key influencers in the organisation? We've always got someone there who's really excited about gamification. Yes, maybe they're at mid-level, but maybe we need to sort of aim a bit higher to who those key influencers are. And also, are we speaking the right language? Are we speaking the language of engagement, but is it something that's a bit more deeper and complex than that, that really reflects the business challenges that organisations are facing? Second reason is insufficient business value, that they couldn't quite see where the business value was. And in their own words, there was no tangible business value. Gamification has now been absorbed into design and UX, which is tiny bit of an insult because it's actually more than it. It's more strategic than that, but that's all they could see in it. UX obviously and design is obviously critically important, but they lost the message that gamification is a strategic management tool and a key problem-solving tool as well. And also investment has been transferred to other digital projects like Agile and AI, and that sort of keeps mentioning again and again as the new shiny things that have taken precedence for investment apart from gamification. So my question to you, have we created a genuine value proposition? Is it enough? Do we need to take it further? Because it seems to not be enough to hold the interests of a lot of these organisations. And also, what part of gamification does not live up to the expectation? So that's something that we need to sort of explore honestly within ourselves and amongst our peers. Shift in roles and responsibilities. So obviously there was a few of them that were not in the same role and or organisation. So once they moved, then obviously you don't know what happens to the organisation there. My role had changed and it did not include gamification. So they did well in their current role in the organisation. When they moved on, they said, yeah, we like you, but yeah, you can not worry about the gamification stuff. So that sort of dovetails into sort of not being able to convince senior management that it's a viable tool. It didn't fit into my new roles and responsibilities, and there was little buy-in in the new position. There were obviously a few people that took it with them, but they're the ones that have always sort of continued with some form of gamification. So what this says to me is that, is it being perceived as a low-level tactical tool, that it can something that can be used and not used? It's something that sort of fits in one role but not necessarily another. And that sort of means that we have defined it very narrowly, or almost too narrowly, that gamification is only one thing, but it's not sort of a multitude of different things. And also, why is it not transferable between roles and projects? If gamification is the strategic management and problem-solving tool that it is, then it should be highly transferable if we're selling it right. So I asked them, how can the gamification industry improve its professional services to you? And there were 6 areas that these respondents came up with. The first one is you need to be more innovative. That was sort of a loud and clear message. And some of the things they were saying is that vendors have been lazy. All platforms look the same and do the same thing. So despite having a wide variety of platforms that they could use out there, they can't differentiate between them. Really, we're all doing and saying the same thing. You need to be more strategic, they've said. We need a compelling value proposition from the community. A whole business solution is needed, and you need to target the C-suite. So that's sort of generally pretty good business advice for anyone working in consulting. And professional. The third one is honesty and clarity on what can and can't be gamified. Because a lot of the projects that these people invested in took the advice of a vendor or a consultant that said, yes, we're going to solve this problem, and it didn't. So, and it's a lot of it is because we're sort of perhaps selling solutions that we own or we are part of, but we're not selling a solution that is right for the client necessarily. The next 3 is fact-based. Organisations want to see high-quality research, validated case studies and use cases. That they need that backup information that what you're saying is right and true. And there's probably been more suspicion and less willingness to experiment now. Because of that, they want to see the numbers. Stop the spin. That came out loud and clear with so many of the respondents. They said, stop promising the world. Don't mention gamification, some of them said, which is interesting and problematic, but anyway. And it's not the holy grail of engagement. So we've been selling engagement equals gamification, but it's not necessarily that or that alone. So that's sort of something that we need to be very careful about, being professional and also not promising the world, and you would give solid business advice to your client regardless of what the final solution is. Like, for example, a lot of consultants turn away work. They say, no, I'm not building a game for you because your problem belongs somewhere else in the organisation. A lot of organisations love that level of honesty, and they're more likely to work with you on different areas. And the last one, which is quite interesting, and it's a challenge for most of us working in the industry because we're basically small and medium-sized enterprises. What a lot of organisations said, it's they want a full-service product. It's too hard dealing with so many small providers. So you've got the consultant, and you've got a game developer, and then you've got a platform, and then someone else who runs a workshop, someone else who designs the strategy. What they're really looking for is an end-to-end solution. Now, there's no easy answers to that because we know the size and the challenges that we all have in our businesses. But listen to what they're saying to us, that we're coming across as very fragmented. And a business solution, particularly with the larger organisations, they need to deal with one organisation that can give them an honest solution, rather than spend all their time trying to balance what everyone is saying against each other. And also something that makes sense as an end-to-end solution, because when you're putting something in those big organisations, it doesn't just stop in design or IT or HR, it needs to run across it. So we need to provide something that's high level and strategic. Now, it is a challenge, but we have to listen to the subtext of what it is that they're asking for. So the customer is always right? Yeah, so, but most of the time, there are other things. I mean, these people aren't perfect either. But the situation is that this is what they expected, sort of, they're looking for something that's strategic, that's very, all control at your fingertips, it's ability to think differently about current problems and situations so they can actually improve on that. That's sort of part of the big promise. But they feel like they always end up with a basic little game that is mildly entertaining for the short term, but doesn't help keep their people engaged throughout sort of the longer term. So short-term effect, which is lovely and nice, but it's not exactly what they were asking for. So, but what have they actually done about that? Interestingly, when I sort of when I went for a deep dive in terms of what they actually did and experimented with, I asked them, what different types of gamification have you experienced? Deliberately sort of left it open. So, only 50% said, oh yes, we tried different mechanics. So in their mind, gamification equals mechanics, okay? So that's, so they tried badges, feedback, leaderboards, challenges, points. I'm like, okay, the plot thickens a little bit here. 30% said, no, we didn't really explore any other different types of gamification. We didn't explore more, we didn't get around to it, didn't really have an interest in it. So, okay, all right, so you didn't sort of actively go out there and sort of look at what other options that you had. 10% said they tried in different areas, so L&D, team building, innovation and marketing, and 10% used it strategically. Now, wonderful things here. They said they used different approaches, different technologies, experimental designs, different design teams, specialist advisory teams, short and long forms. Now, these are the treasure chest of where you can actually use gamification in a lot more sustainable way and a lot more profitable way, because you're solving deep business problems. So effectively, 10% of those people were still using it strategically. But it looks like they were sort of looking for us, or as the gamification community, to help lead them along that way. So, I mean, a lot of that was some of their own initiative, but also that's where the strategic gap is. So in terms of our industry, there's interesting lessons in that. There was a high positive correlation amongst organisations that took a strategic approach to gamification and their levels of satisfaction. All those that were using tactical gamification, we experimented with different mechanics and all that kind of stuff. They're the ones that had the highest rate of dissatisfaction. So interesting. The more strategic approach you use, the happier you are because your outcomes will be a lot better. So some perspective, and it's not all about you. So don't sort of think I'm sort of saying it, we're all wicked people and all that. There's two categories, design issues. The commoditisation of design. Now, it seems like business is great. They'll grab onto it. Every time I go into an organisation, they say, we want to do gamification. We've done agile, we've done design thinking, and now we want to do gamification. So, like everybody wants to do design, whatever it's called, and everybody's a designer now. So it's something that they value, but they've sort of commoditised it. They can't sort of see the complexity and the skill base that's required to do excellent, sustainable, and strategic design. The demise of design thinking, it's doing well and it has done well and it will continue to do well, but there's been a backlash from organisations saying design thinking is great, but it doesn't actually lead to viable prototypes and viable changes in organisations. So the business community is starting to push back from that, and by doing that, they're also pushing back on any sort of design-based approaches that they find that are sort of unconvincing at the moment. There's an uncomfortable connection with the games industry as well. So a lot of people say that, the culture in the games industry, how they treat their people, how they treat their users, all that kind of stuff. So we can't get away from that. So that is sort of there and a challenge that we have to face. And also the fact that but we don't want to do games. So they still have a notion that it is a game and it's connected to the games industry somehow. So that's sort of it has been and always will be an uncomfortable alliance. And the infantilization of business processes. We're sort of running in there, we're saying, things are going to be fun, we're going to play games, you're going to improve your motivation. To them it's wearing thin and it's sounding a bit childish. So, it's just like, business is fun, it's serious business, serious play, all that kind of stuff. It's all sort of quite valid, but to them it's part of that spin and they're not listening to that anymore. So we need to sort of perhaps take a bit more of an adult approach to it. And the other issues, which are sort of far more macro issues that are sort of affecting a lot of areas in business, particularly those offering new different approaches, is the rise of agile and the quick, cheap fix. And the quick, cheap fix as the next big thing again. So there's a lot of organisations that are now doing agile, a lot of agile coaches saying, no, I'm also a gamification expert, so they'll sort of run a few games and all that kind of stuff. So agile is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but it's everything's a lot of issues, a lot of tools and techniques that gamification is using has been rolled into agile, and they're the ones that are sort of picking up our ball and running with it. New shiny things, a lot of organisations said, there's a lot of money, money's not the issue, but we're going to invest in AI and blockchain and all those other sort of new shiny things. And a lot of the people I spoke to is that I continue to try with gamification, but everyone's more interested in these other things now. But that's the nature of business. So all that means is that we have to always reinvent and make sure that we're not saying the same thing over and over, but how are we incorporating some of these new technologies as well? Because they certainly have application for us. The predominance of scalability in platforms. Now, this is the big thing. A lot of gamification cannot be scaled, and organisations are looking for scale. Which means is that they're looking for platforms or a platform that has the support networks that it has to instigate some level of digital transformation in an organisation. So not just the plug-and-play platform, it needs, which is what they're looking for scalability, but it's the support systems around that to make it into, you don't want to grow as big as a SAP, for example, but if you learn from those big platforms and how they scaled, there's some interesting lessons in terms of how we can grow and develop our service offering. And short-termism and the middle, a lot of the times we're talking not to the wrong people, but into the middle of an organisation. There's a lot of short-term thinking in industry today. Our whole global business community is affected by instability at the political levels in many areas. So organisations don't want to take any long-term decisions about any investments, and I think gamification is also suffering because of that. So, talk about tomorrow. What does this mean for us? Now, before we go into that, I'd like you to all stand up. This is not the game, this is just another conversation. Stand up and choose another person next to you, not the person you played rock, paper, scissors with. And I want you to have a discussion, or you can groups of 2 or 3. I want you to tell that person what is true for you. What was discussed here that touched a nerve for you? Thank you for sharing, and take a seat. Can we have 2 volunteers to talk about something that they feel strongly about? Yes?
Okay, thank you. So I'm Manuel from Portugal. And yeah, I think the problem of us losing credibility as a community is kind of a recurring thing about everything that becomes a buzzword. So I did a lot of design thinking before entering gamification. And our company did the whole 9 yards. So we went to IDEO, we learned from the best, and we did the whole process. We got certified to be sure that we were doing the right thing. But everybody around us was saying, I do design thinking, and they weren't doing design thinking, they were doing something else.
Yeah.
And it's happening the same with gamification from the start. So I started looking at this in 2012, and even then you had big companies, and I don't need to mention their names because you all know them, that were saying, we do gamification, and they were big, and they had big investment, but they were just doing a simple PBL and saying, oh, we're having this impact because they were working with big organizations. It's easy to have an impact.
Yeah, thank you, Manuel. One more person, this side of the room. Excellent.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, what is true for me, I think we're at a stage where we have to find something that's more engaging than just a mere fact of fun. So we have to go deeper than that. And what I believe in is more finding a meaning, like a connection, a personal connection to the aim of the company. So it's a much more deeper meaning. And then through that grow for fun, not for just sake of fun, but find something deeper inside of a personal motivation.
Fantastic. Okay. We'll only take one last one, and then we'll continue with the rest. And we can have a discussion over morning tea, which is right after my session. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it also has to do with managing expectations. I was just saying what we do when I send, when you get in contact with any client, I always send them one proposal because I have one standardized proposal with some fixed prices for every phase we get into. And that's the one I send out. And I say, if this is not something for you, if you don't want to do it as a strategic tool, don't do it. So I lose 90% of all my prospects immediately because it's too much money or too complicated for them. Which is fine because you don't want to get involved with those companies anyway, because in the end, it will hurt them. So I'm always aiming high for big international clients, and I only get 1 or 2 a year, but that's all I can handle anyway, so it's fine. And I'll be talking about this tomorrow a little bit more.
Excellent.
But I think that's the most important thing, to be honest about the expectations and don't spell this, so don't sell the spin.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. We can continue this conversation. Okay. Okay, so from player to professional, just sort of working on the title. Do you know that my original proposal for this talk was something different, but they said, no, you tell them the truth, kick them up the bum. Let's sort of work on improving that. So I'm glad it's actually the best choice, so thank you. So in terms of from player to professional, how do we level up? How do we change this game to be not only better for us, but also better for the community and the business community that we're serving? So, good question. How might we better serve industry needs to create sustainable value? Now, I'm not going to give you answers here. I'm going to give you sort of more questions, and I think we as a community can continue this conversation, not only here, but thereafter. I think there's some cards there that you can put some notes in terms of how we can take this further. And the good news, or the bad news, is that no one cares that you love games, play games, or design games. So we need to let it go, move on. We've started with something excellent. Now let's just move on a bit. Okay, so from player to professional, the 6 areas that I mentioned earlier in terms of what organisations suggested that we can do better. I've got questions for you, and this is questions that you have to ask yourself every time you're sitting in front of a client or putting together a proposal. Is my product really the best fit for this client? What research am I conducting or using? Is it validated? And for Stop the Spin, am I espousing the same old rhetoric? How can I change my message? You know, what am I really trying to do? What am I really trying to say? In terms of being innovative, am I just providing more of the same? Look, if you're making money out of more of the same, that's fine. But if you want to grow or you feel like there's something not quite right, just really look at your product offering and see what product development that you can do. In terms of being strategic, am I considering the systemic issues and boundary conditions of this problem? And I'll elaborate on that shortly. And also with full service, a big challenge for sizes of the businesses, etc., is that am I selling a complete solution? And how can I better offer that solution or manage expectations that you're not? And in terms of the notion of games as what we've learned from them, the map is not the territory. It's what we've learned from. It's not about games. I know we keep saying that. We almost say it to ourselves, but the map appears to be more real than the land. And I think when this whole thing started, it was all about what are those innate qualities about games and game design that we're actually learning from. It's not about the game itself, because that's just the map. So in terms of maps are necessary but flawed, so obviously we need something sort of to base it on, but it's not reality, and gamification is not, it's an abstraction of reality. So gamification is an abstraction of those magical qualities that make games what they are, but also what can we apply from that, the learnings of how they're made and how we interact with them, and take some new insights from that. So what we need to do is go back to the first principles. What was it that first made games magic to us? And what is it that we saw in them that helped us reshape how we think, how we design processes, how we design products? And also I say here before, what was at the core of gamification before it was hacked by basic behaviouralism and technology. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with it, but it's all become about behaviour design, and it's all become about how technology can influence productivity and all that kind of stuff. Because at the essence of my interest in business and my core business is in creativity and innovation. And behaviouralism and technology push does not necessarily make your organisations more creative or more innovative, because it's something about the persuasive technology that actually funnels people down a certain track rather than gets them to think expansively. So I just want to take you back to the Ludomix, which is the gamification taxonomy that was developed. Gamification is many things. Now, we all know about the digital games. You know, McDonald's has play digital games. A lot of marketing people use those to purchase product, buy product. A lot of gamified platforms that we have, serious games and simulations. And I know there's a lot of issues with the community about thinking gamification isn't this or that, but this is according to the business community. This is what they perceive gamification to be. So overall, it's about how organisations can create stakeholder value. Right, so we're creating stakeholder value using games, game elements, the elephant in the room, right? Gameful or playful experiences. So I just want to draw your attention to playful experiences and the rise of this genre of gamification. So what are people doing in terms of playful experiences? We're using lots of Lego serious play, improv. A lot of product design is now becoming much more playful. A lot of interactive workshops, game design, design sprints, sort of a lot of the agile workshops are using very playful elements. LARPs, role-playing, game-storming type games are starting to have another resurgence. A lot of hackathons, escape rooms, which a lot of card and board games have been played and developed. Virtual reality and a whole host of other what we call playful experiences are really picking up. So a lot of organisations are identifying these things as gamification or gameful or playful experiences that enable them to think differently about their business problems. So they're seeing something in that, and it's far beyond what we initially described it as, the points, badges, leaderboards of key elements that we've taken out. So what our business community is telling us is that they see that gameful and playful design is a lot bigger than what we've sort of initially narrowly defined it as. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. When we're looking about the traditional elements of what gamification was, or what we call the traditional gamification, it's almost hit its limits to growth. because there's only so many digital games that you can have. So it's not necessarily sort of giving the right message. So what happens is that you've developed a digital game, but the users see that as buy my product. So I'm playing this game, but I know you want me, at the back of your mind, you're always saying, I know you want me to buy this product. I know, so, and other people using gamified platforms, so those platforms are basically telling them, do your job and have a smile about it, and here's a star while you're there. Serious games and simulations, great, but once again, you're saying, do your lesson. So basically, what these gamified, obviously not all of them are doing the same thing, but we're still doing that top-down, hierarchical, very paternalistic view, but we're using technological tools to do that. You've heard about the technological whip. So it's basically using, traditional management techniques, which have, brought us to the situation we're in now. But technology is being used to actually support those ineffective business practices rather than change them. So basically, these are designer or expert-driven. They're closed-loop systems. They have persuasive technology push. They persuade people, like a light flashes, push this button. So it's very behavioralistic. It's not allowing you to think outside of that. It's system conform default. So it's all they've mapped the gameplay, and what it forces you to do is play within the system, not look or play outside of the system, is where we want people to be more creative and innovative. It supports the status quo, and it's something that is called finite games, and I'll talk about finite games in a minute. Alternatively, what the playful experiences do is that they fill the experience gap. Right, so there's a far more elements of how we create some kind of autonomy and agency with the material that we're working with. So playful experiences tend to be very open-ended. So they're interpretive. You can interpret those games in many different ways rather than what we're telling you how to interpret a game. It's highly interactive, and very often they're co-designed. So there's a lot more autonomy there. There's a lot more agency if you're part of that sort of design. And it gives you a lot of creativity as well, because if you're part of the process, it's very experiential. So it's not just sort of digital, it creates that sort of whole of body experiences as well. And these are what we call finite games. And these are the difference. So finite versus infinite games. James Carse, people are familiar with his amazing work. If you haven't, you must read. So basically he talks about two types of, and it's not just games, as in digital games that we play, but the games we play at work, the games that we play in business and politics. It's a cultural sort of notion of what games are. So with finite games, they're basically closed-loop systems, a reflection of the status quo. And the key elements of these games is tactical activities. Here, you're busy sort of doing stuff, pressing buttons, all that kind of stuff. They've got rules, boundaries, winners and losers. Now we're sort of getting a picture of the business and mentality and culture that is starting to reflect. It seeks power and control. It's theatrical and requires an audience. Right. Whereas infinite games require authentic interaction with each other. So it's not sort of a tactical activity, let's do stuff, we're actually working together on something. It's got fluid rules and boundaries and experiences. So there's no set rules, that we make the rules as we go along and we can change them and question them. So there's no questioning the rules of finite games, but there is in infinite games. There's an element of self-sufficiency and building strength. And it's dramatic but requires participation. So rather than theater, and you can sort of see the differences in politics. Politics is very much a finite game. Winners, losers, I require an audience. But infinite games are those that are much more focused on creativity and innovation, and that requires true participation and authentic leadership in there. So when you're sort of designing your games or your interactions, which way are you actually pushing your client without sort of really knowing? If they say they want to be different and creative and innovative and they want to sort of transform their organisations, if you're designing a lot of finite games and interactions, you're not actually going to go there, you're just sort of moving around in circles, whereas you're opening things up a lot more with infinite games to really sort of test those boundaries and see what future horizons there are. So in terms of systemic constraints, so we're limited by what an organisation says and does, right? So with, I know I talked about this last year, but just a quick recap is that the systems iceberg, in terms of any systemic change in organisations and businesses, it's a big ask. You are there, up there, the polar bear on the top tip of the iceberg, but what we're mostly responding to are events, high-level events. Oh, my people aren't happy, my customer's not buying my product, people aren't using a system that I implemented. We're dealing with events the whole time. So we can continue to design for events as we do, because given the nature of the projects and how much we're expected to be strategic or work deeper in an organisation, we can't help but to do those. But you need to be aware that any true systemic change comes all the way down there. That's where true innovation happens. We're changing mental models and attitudes about how we relate to each other, how we design our organisational systems and interactions. Are we being infinite or finite? And also the system structures that we've got. It takes a long time to change the current structures in an organisation and the vested interests that go with that, the fiefdoms and the hierarchies in that. That takes a lot of time to change or to get deep down into those things. So when you're sort of promising the world, don't sort of promise transformation unless you're actually working down at that deep level in an organisation that's looking for true systemic change. And also understanding the systems. Now, in systems complexity, the Cynefin model that was developed by Dave Snowden shows that our organisations can be one of 4 basic types of systems. In simple systems, we have stable processes. We have known knowns and we use best practice in those systems. And a lot of the gamification that we've used, for example, Siemens, when they've used, they plays their games, they know exactly what it takes to run an engineering factory in an engineering business. So they have got step-by-step instructions. They've got best practice in there. This is what you need to do. Any problems happen, they're solved. So that's a basic sort of self-sufficient closed loop system. With complicated businesses, there's what they call they're mostly stable businesses, but that there's known unknowns. We know all this stuff, but there's a little bit that we don't know, and you can use gamification to fill those gaps. So, for example, Nike Plus, when they developed that app, yes, it was a great marketing tool, but their main objective was to collect data about their customers that they did not know before. So they knew that X amount of people from X amount of countries, but they needed more detailed data, and that's why the app was created to collect that. So that gamification was spot on. It was amazing. And also those innovation, ideation, sort of gamification elements that you have. A lot of banks, insurance companies use them. We know that organisations know basically what they want to do or where they want to go, but there's some elements that they don't know, and those apps can actually help fill those knowledge gaps. Where it gets complicated is on your left-hand side, where you've got complex and chaotic systems, and this is where the majority of our businesses are working in today. So in terms of complex systems, there's turbulent, unpredictable, and constantly changing environments. And very often you get a lot of organisations saying, oh, we've got to do something, design thinking, gamification, what is it? So it's hard to predict what is actually happening because there's unknowns in the system. And we need to sort of use probes, safe fail experiments to actually sort of work out what the situation is. And a good example of that is with Foldit, that they had, that there was no way to actually explore what they didn't know until they opened up all that data through that game and crowdsourced a lot of different skills and abilities to actually help solve that problem. And in chaotic environments, it's obviously something that you can't sort of use a game to control that because you're doing it in retrospect. But what happens is that gamification is used to prepare organisations. Like the Red Cross, for example, uses a lot of escape rooms and theatre improv to prepare. So what in chaotic environments, they're using a lot of these playful games and elements to teach people how to relate to each other, how to communicate very quickly and think on their feet, and to develop those relations and think outside the square of all possible scenarios. So this gamification can be fit for purpose, but you must understand the system that you're designing for. Because if we're designing the right solutions for the right problem, then we're not going to have the level of project failure or dissatisfaction that we're seeing that's merged over the last sort of 4 years. So in terms of sort of your complicated and simple systems, which are basically stable, those finite games might be good. Buy my product, learn your lesson, that's all really good. But in terms of complex and chaotic systems, where we're finding a lot of our organisations in, think differently about your Ludo mix. There's a different type of technology, different type of interactions and playful experiences that you could be using to improve their skills and the product development that they need to prepare themselves for, uncertain futures. New Horizons. I'm running on time, so this is... I've got the thumbs up, okay. New Horizons, a short one. Now, I know I said, games aren't everything, but we're going to take some lessons from what's happening in the games industry. And as we know, they're an odd bunch. They don't like gamification and all that kind of stuff, but there's still important things that we can learn about what's happening in their world. And what I want to draw your attention to is the emergence of the first-person walker genre. People familiar with first-person walker games? The games industry believes that these aren't real games. There's no sort of definite game mechanics that you're using. So it has the industry's been in a bit of a tiz. This is a scene from a game called Dear Esther, which came out in 2012. And since that time, and perhaps a little bit before, these new games are emerging, which are narrative and experiential based and look very different to what digital games have always been up until now. And the games industry is in a little bit of a tiz about it, particularly in terms of how it's been defined. So in terms of what games like Dear Esther are showing is that they're responding to a section of the game playing community that's looking for more complex, deeper interactions and something that they can learn, sort of deep lessons about themselves and the world that they live in. So these minimalist games have been stripped of complex mechanics and gameplay. Right? So they removed all that, and it's hard to imagine unless you've actually played these games. So hyperrealism is avoided because we want to anchor them in reality. So there's no spinning wheels and all that kind of stuff because that's behaviouralism at its peak, trying to sort of distract people from the current problem. So hyperrealism is because you want to anchor them in reality. And there's no quantifiable systems. No points pages or leaderboards in these games, so because it's all narrative and experiential based. Nothing can be learned and predicted because once you're able to learn, like a lot of behavioural elements in games, you learn what the pattern is, you can predict it, and you've beaten the game. None of these they're very much, you experience things from different angles, that there is no one answer, that you can view the problem from many different angles and you leave the game with your own interpretation, that there's no single answer you come out of that. And it defies traditional ludic elements, which is why it's got game scholars in a little bit of a tiz, but all very excited nevertheless. They're also sort of immersive and experiential, so they're narrative-driven, and you interact with symbols and artefacts. Like in Dear Esther, you find fragments of letters and fragments of different bits and pieces of the mystery of how Esther died and all that kind of stuff. I won't ruin it for you. It gives the player space to explore, see and feel. So you're not sort of driving sort of home and like, this is the game, these are the rules, everything that we traditionally knew about games and gamification, all that has sort of fallen to the wayside. It's like walking through an installation to reflect, hence first-person walker as opposed to shooter where you actually do something. It slows down the pace to enable thinking. Real human thinking, not driving people to think a certain way, but give them the space to think for themselves. Creativity, innovation, hello. And prepares us for complex synthetic worlds that Castronova wrote about a long time ago, that we are sort of exploring these virtual and synthetic worlds as an important and viable part of our work and personal lives as well. So these are sort of a first entree into that. So in terms of that and media convergence, I was in London 6 months ago and I played Somni, which was basically an amazing, it's almost like a first-person walker, but had elements of theatre. So it's a narrative-driven, it's a story. It's got a lot of transmedia. So with transmedia, so it had elements of parts of it. I walked in there and I walked into a theatre. So we sat down and someone read a story to us. And then we were transferred to another room and we were given an experience of how we were interacting with the different artefacts in that room. Other parts of it, we had to put on our virtual reality gear to experience something in a completely different world. And then there was more virtual reality gear in different areas to explore different rooms, to explore different realms. Highly experiential, but enabled you to feel everything. Like, you know, I feel stuff when I play games, I'm getting excited and all the rest of it. But this is that whole of mind, whole of body experience that really immerses us. Now, these are the open-ended exploration. You're a player, you're an observer, and you're part creator as well. So these are the things that what business is trying to do. How can we look at our current business challenges in a new and different way? What new experiences can we give our staff to learn something differently about the current material rather than read this, play that? Is it something that we sort of need to also do with our strategy teams to really experience business problems in a completely different way rather than just looking at numbers on paper in a boardroom? So what this realm now opens up is whole completely new horizons. I know it might sound a little bit freaky, but these things have been emerging over the last 10 years and are really starting to end up in some kind of interesting consumer formats and experiences. So if that's what's happening in transmedia and if that's what's happening in the games industry, what is the next evolution for gamification? Because both those areas are leaving us way behind. So I think we need to sort of think very creatively and innovatively about what it is, who it is that we are, what is it that we're trying to do, and how do we sort of move from here and reinvent what we currently have. So, in summary, from player to professional, the map is not the territory, so we have a good guide. So let's go back to the first principles of what was it that made gamification so amazing all those years ago, and where was it that we dropped the ball somewhere along the way. Let's visit those first principles and see where that sort of important magic was. Know the difference between infinite and finite games, because we're creating completely different experiences by doing that. And on another level, subconsciously, we're telling our staff, we're telling our customers a message in that if you're only giving them a finite game, you're basically saying to them, we have all the control authority, not you. And is that what you're trying to do in some of your creative and innovation projects? Probably not. Work with systems, and I know I've been saying this for years, but I'll keep saying it. Understand the system that you're designing for, and because you have enormous systemic constraints. And once you understand those constraints, you're better able to diagnose the problem and devise a solution, and also sort of keeping it real in terms of managing expectations. And explore new horizons. So there's amazing stuff happening there with transmedia and those first-person walker games. Don't look at necessarily the technology, but look at what it is that those mediums are trying to do. They're trying to give people much deeper and more meaningful experiences than what they have before. So I think there's room for us to level up in that regard. That's it. Okay. On time.